Okay, is all the food ready in this Apush 1.5 like that and everything? So what's important? Tomorrow, definitely I keep reminding you, probably the first question is going to be something about the women's race rights on there. So make sure, and I promise you, what I go over today, there'll probably be two or three questions from here what I go over today on tomorrow's quiz as well. So maybe even a little bit more because you're talking about the fight for African American equality between 1865, all right, to 1900. And that's change over time. Why? What kind of changes do you see over time from 1865 to 1900 in the African American fight for equality? Go ahead and hit me with something here. What does it change over time? And we always talk about civil rights. I love talking about this time period because once immediately start talking about civil rights, people are like, oh, Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, sit-ins in Greensboro, but nobody thinks about the 19th century and the kind of like change over time at this part here. So, all right. Oh, my little brother. Okay, see ya. All right. Go ahead, Miss Miriam, in between your food.
Yeah, no problem. So, okay, 13th Amendment, during the, or slash like during slash end of Civil War, 14th Amendment, as well. I'm pretty sure 15th Amendment before 1500s. And then there was like Reconstruction, not 1500, before 1900. And then there was like Reconstruction, and then Reconstruction ended, and then you start like does Jim Crow start then?
Jim Crow starts around in the 1880s. We get these Southern Redeemers coming back into power, and the Solid South Democrats are being elected in the House of Representatives. Right? And the Democrats control the Southern state legislatures and the state governments, back redeeming themselves back into the 1880s. So, what is the kind of change that you've kind of noticed there that you kind of like, in between breaths and eating food there that you notice? Well, right now, again, you're stuffing yourself. Well, so what is the change between Reconstruction and Black civil rights in the 1880s here? So a lot of action here today in A Push 1.5, family stuff and eating stuff here. Hit me, Malika.
It's kind of like after the Civil War, they were like increasing with like getting equality.
Yes.
And then after
Yes.
the Reconstruction ended, this went down.
Yes. So you really do get, even though there's some violence, with the Freedmen's Bureau, with the amendments that Mary was talked about, and as Malika was saying, you get a strive for equality. You see the number of like black senators that are elected in Mississippi, the black legislature in South Carolina. You see monumental gains, almost exponential gains. But then you see a reversal of fortune here. So after Grant was trying to challenge the Klan and got rid of it, you see slowly with the liberal Republicans and the people up north feeling like, well, Reconstruction should start coming to an end because we're getting tired of these kind of African American problems and freedmen's problems when we're trying to make money, prosper, advance as a whole nation. And so I we don't understand what is the kind of problems, and we don't actually care that much as we're advancing up north. So instead of African Americans and other groups of people too, I don't want to just say that, fighting for like civil rights, immigrant groups, people band together. They're not just as total victims of like, oh my God, what we're gonna do. It's again, people are persecuted, changing laws. People start fighting for these kind of like laws, and they start fighting Jim Crow in court. In one of the most famous cases, as you know, with Homer Plessy down there in Louisiana, trying to integrate the streetcars down there. This case really happens to him in 1893, gets to the Supreme Court in 1896.
What's the case called?
Plessy versus Ferguson. You know the case. You know the case. I say, you know that one from first grade. And that's a deal breaker case. And what was the decision? Separate but equal, like that. So, and Brown is going to overturn that in 1954. you have to know those kind of bookend cases right there. And I think you learned them since first grade in a way, but just know them for sure. But this happens during the Gilded Age. Yes, sir. 1954. All right. So now they ask a prominent African American in Congress. They bring him to Congress because they want to know his kind of like thoughts on the Plessy case. And this guy is Booker T. Washington. All right. So I'll keep saying this because we forget about it because it's 2019, the most famous African American up until Martin Luther King for sure. That's the one that you would have up from slavery. That book that's kind of autobiographical that he wrote. He was born into slavery as a child, and he did help find the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. So they asked him about was the Plessy case like really fair? And again, you still see Republicans and still Republicans at this time trying to see if things are kind of working out for African Americans as they're suffering from, you know, segregation. The Congress even says there is a dissenting opinion in the Supreme Court decision. What does it mean to dissent? What do you think it means? Conflicting, disagree. All right. And his name is Justice John Marshall Harlan. He says the Constitution is colorblind. And this is the worst decision. He calls it pernicious. I know people always asking about vocabulary words, but it's the worst decision since what decision in 1856? Justice John Marshall Harlan. He is not the Chief Justice, and it's not so much that you kind of like have to remember his name tomorrow. Just notice that people are disagreeing, and people always at this time. Well, Mr. Bryce, everybody thought back then. Everybody was social darkness. Everybody's white supremacists. Like, no, they're not. All right, not saying it's the prevailing attitude, but that's not an excuse. Like, how do you think about this at certain times? Like, a lot of people when I was growing up, again, were pretty much discriminatory and said bad names about people who were homosexual. It's like that. That was prevailing. But there were some enlightened people in my generation. Mr. Price was not one of them, like again, at that time. Seriously. But there are people there that's like, what's wrong with him? I'm like, like that. And I probably said some worse names. And like, well, there's nothing wrong with somebody like again that born that way. They're enlightened people. So there's always enlightened people, if you want to call them ahead of their time. So that's not really the excuse, but it kind of tells you about what the prevailing thought is. So Justice John Marshall Harlan says that Constitution is colorblind. All right, it's the worst decision since which one in 1857? There, I think I said 56 before. Dred Scott, right? So they asked Booker T. Washington. Now, what do you know of your Booker T. Washington? Maybe you've already read this week, maybe before, maybe from elementary and middle school. What do you think his opinion about Plessy versus Ferguson? Does anybody know? Like, besides they kind of founded the Tuskegee Institute, is there anything that maybe that like you can deduce what his kind of like, what would he say about this at this time? So go ahead, Mary.
So I know Booker T. Washington was an activist, but he didn't want to like agitate things further. So I'm assuming he would have said, yeah, it's okay.
Probably not. He did not explicitly say it was okay, but he definitely did not. He said it's like this is something we can do. He is known as a leading accommodationist. All right, they accommodate. And the thing that you have to understand that I get upset about over time, anytime you talk about African American civil rights leaders, like W.B. Du Bois versus Booker T. Washington in the clash of titans, like Malcolm X versus Martin Luther King. They more agreed than disagreed. W.B. Du Bois really did not start disagreeing with Booker T. Washington until later on into the 20th century. But I know I'm always working against what the prevailing thought. Oh, well, Booker T. Washington versus W.B. Du Bois. It's not really like that. They had two different ways, but they more agreed than disagreed. Booker T. Washington worked behind the scenes. Now, here's the thing is that I'm going to defend Booker T. Washington about. Booker T. Washington, do Anybody know where Tuskegee Institute is located? It's in Alabama, outside of Birmingham. Now, you're kind of in a tough situation. If you want to be agitating, talking about boycott or challenge cases in this, Supreme Court, what would keep whites from going to Tuskegee Institute and burning it down? Just tell me like that. Mr. Price, you mean they did things like that? You mean actually like if people raised like, in neighborhoods or certain like colleges or churches, they would burn down those churches? Yes, they did. I don't know if you probably don't you think I'm lying about that after you've done the reading. They would run people out. I told you, Colfax, Louisiana. So they would do that. He knew that. He was in a tough spot. It's kind of easy if you're W. Du Bois, you're Harvard educated, you're in Massachusetts, you know, to kind of like be free and talk about agitation. Booker T. Washington had a kind of like a difficult kind of challenge for him. And let me just say that some of the things that he did working behind the scenes that people believe that like, want to call him an Uncle Tom or something like that, um, he gave a lot of land grants to historically black colleges. He raised over $1.5 million for like the endowment for Tuskegee Institute that gives scholarships. He sponsored black newspapers. He sponsored the National Business League. And he gave a lot of money secretly to a lot of cases that were being challenged in district courts and federal courts and Supreme Court. Why couldn't he do that openly? Because he had to play the kind of role of the good African American. You cannot be someone they want. He's not W.B. Du Bois. You got to say like, well, you're not like those, communist, black leaders like, in the Knights of Labor. You're a good person. And he was shuck and jive, as they say. They love to hear him speak, like that. They love his anti-immigrant, like, kind of speeches. They love his kind of accommodationist. The most famous one is the Atlanta Compromise. It's labeled at 1895. He's in Atlanta at the Cotton Exposition. He says, you know what? Segregation's okay. For the most part, he's saying that in a way. So he's saying that, like, and his quote is that in all things that are purely social, we can be separate as the fingers on the hand. Yet, you know, but in all things toward mutual progress, like again, we can be together like that. So as far as mutual progress, but there's nothing wrong with being segregation. And he had three things that he talked about that I want you to kind of remember: dignity, discipline, and independence. He wanted a lot of African Americans to make sure they have economic independence. It's a little problem with that. What is the type of jobs that Tuskegee was kind of preparing a lot of them for? What kind of jobs? Labor, manual labor, housekeeping, the housekeeping arts, the groundskeeping kind of skills. So this is where W.B. Du Bois was beginning to examine the Tuskegee, like, political machine. And it was a political machine because if you're running for African American, you're running like, in some kind of office like that, you had to go to Booker T. Washington, kind of get his endorsement. And W.B. Du Bois is like, well, I have a PhD. What is it that like African Americans are born with that they cannot get a PhD? They cannot become a doctor or a lawyer. Why can't I vote? Why can't I live in a neighborhood that I want to? You know, well, but he's asking that. He's asking why can't we? I see what you're saying. Yeah, exactly. Thanks. I'm sorry. Yeah, but that's where he begins to challenge, like maybe the approach of Booker T. Washington is like, well, why can't we agitate, especially in the courts? Like that. We need a formal organization of professional African Americans, and I don't care if like with whites too. And then 1909, the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And the people today always get offended and like, well, I'm surprised. Why that exists today? Why they call it colored? Why they call it the African? Well, W.B. Du Bois had a world view. He thought colored meant like more people around the world. So he did not just want to mean that colored folks in the United States. So he wanted to make it a kind of world protest for equality. So he tried to form the Niagara movement 3 years earlier in 1906. The reason why it's called Niagara movie because they were in Buffalo and they could not find a hotel. Why couldn't they find a hotel? Because everything was booked up. It's a busy season. Now, again, where's Buffalo located?
New York.
Hmm. Don't they? I thought they didn't have segregation up north like that. It's just WB Du Bois right there. So, how do you explain that? I thought everything was integrated. What is that called?
That's
What is that Latin term? Kind of like the law term. What kind of segregation? De facto. All right, by the fact. And what's down south? De jure. DEJURE. De facto means that just by default, just by tradition, you don't expect that, like, blacks are going to be in there like in a white hotel. You're not going to have blacks moving into white neighborhoods in Chicago. That's de facto. De jure, JURE, is warned by justice by law that you're going to have, like, you can be arrested, as again, immediately or something like that, if you're, drinking out of a, like, again, a white, water fountain like that. So, and again, it's just by laws that you have on there. So that's W.B. Du Bois kind of ploy about doing that is, and, he thought the problems of the 20th century would be the problem of the color line. And I think he made a big prediction about that. And we cannot be accommodations. Go ahead. Yes, yes, it is. And I think, Sam, I'm kind of lining up Du Bois as kind of NAACP. All right. So, again, and he's talking, and he sponsored a newspaper called The Crisis, you know, and he wrote a very famous book. His book is The Soul of Black Folks. All right. Booker T. Washington's book, Up from Slavery. So you see these two different avenues, but again, please don't try to pit one against the other and trying to like this kind of thing and this kind of, that like one was right, the other one was wrong. Because I think there's a reason why. Why do you think people try to project that on African American leaders or maybe other leaders to kind of fight for pro? Exactly. Divide and conquer. Well, you don't want to be like Simon W. E. Du Bois, not Booker T. Washington. He's a good guy. Oh, well, Booker T. Washington, he's a accommodationist. He's Uncle Tom. W. E. Du Bois is educated. But then W. E. Du Bois liked black people who looked like him. That means light skinned black people, the talented 10. So he's a little bit elitist himself amongst African Americans. So that's kind of my criticism of W.B. Du Bois himself too, is that like, there's some problems you can look at both sides, but both are still trying to, thread the needle in this very, very harsh climate of protests where you could lose your life or somebody in your family could lose their life or you can lose the means to kind of have a kind of decent life in an instance. There's no doubt about it. So, particularly down south, sometimes up north too. North, you had more ways of defending yourself, and definitely sometimes out west. Things happen in a flash, and you can look up any incidents at this time where that did happen, even if it's something that's like where people just decide they're going to like run people out of town. So that's what they're doing. So those are the two like on the side. So hopefully they're like, and Mary said the right word about accommodation is kind of a way, and more gradualism through economics. I think W.B. Du Bois is gradualism through kind of politics. Okay. So, I mean, he wanted some immediacy, but both of them are going to take some kind of gradual kind of approach in a way. So, hopefully that clears that because it definitely be one or two questions knowing the dividing, like who is who and which one was taking one angle from the other, but they're both fighting for some rights. Now, in comes the one of my favorite heroes again, and it's a woman again. So, and some of the titles of her autobiographies is like really just really says it all right there. It's like A Sword Amongst Lions, and that's a book I just read this summer about her, like that. To keep the waters troubled. This is Ida Wells Barnett. And you say, Well, I'm surprised. She's hyphenated in the Gilded Age? Yes. Because she had a lot of suitors, and she says, I am not going to be with a dumb guy. My, yes. Like that. She had a lot of suitors, a lot like that. Again, not one of these short-statured women about the size of Harriet Tubman, but that she married a lawyer, Mr. Barnett, like that. So, but she says, I am not going to marry a man who does not respect feminism, like that, and that's in the Gilded Age, way ahead of her time, you know. And then before Claudette Colvin, before Rosa Parks, she's biting a guy on a railroad train because she's sitting in a kind of like, again, a seat that she had a ticket for with white women in the non-smoking area. It's like, no, you have to sit with the black men who are smoking. It's like, no, I'm not, and get your hands off me. So it not only took that guy, they had to stop the train and get two more people to come in there. She's just an amazing, amazing woman. And again, this is a woman who does not like the Chicago World's Fair because it presents Africans as like people in like, half naked loincloths with spears and shields. She says boycott the Chicago, like, World's Fair, you know? And she's the one that gets after Frances Willard of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Said, well, it should be called a white Christian temperance union because I don't see anybody black in your like temperance movement. You have a good cause, but where's the black people at? She is a woman who tells the newspaper editors, I'm going down south to see about this lynchings because everybody's saying like, these people are like, getting lynched and murdered over crimes they committed. But I think it's mob justice. I'm going to take my gun. I know I'm going to be like tracked down. If I'm caught, I will take one or two of them out with me. All right. And it's called a red record. Like that. She is bad A, and this is one, and usually, but it usually takes the women who are very, who it kind of, they get more of an opportunity than black men. They know that, but sometimes they really run with it like that. A Mary Church Terrell. These are other people you'll forget, and they really try to make these kind of bold statements. I tell you, they want to keep her out of like the suffrage parade like they're having for Woodrow Wilson. Ida Wells. She's like, well, I will just march on our own then. Once again, sort of the Women's Colored Alliance for voting, and that's what she did in a way. It's like that. So, and again, this is somebody who's not going to get a lot of credit. She helped tutor like W.B. Du Bois, kind of mentor. And W.B. Du Bois said like, did she help found the NAACP? Well, yeah, but she's not formally educated, you know. And Ida Wells heard that and it's like, well, you know what, W.B. Du Bois, I wish he would say that to my face like that, because I don't think he'll be able to talk anymore if he says that to my face. Because she did help found the NAACP. But W.B. Du Bois is a little elitist. The reason why, again, Ida Wells did not keep on teaching her teaching job is because she thought it was demeaning because she had to teach in this one room school, no books. And she's like, you know what? This is not equal. This is not fair in these facilities. I'm not going to like put myself down and be working in a facility because I'm saying I'm compliant with all this, inferior school. I'm going to be a journalist like that. And she read to herself. And again, when she was at a young age, she lost her parents to yellow fever. She uh, took care of her five siblings like that, five of them like that, because she did not want them to be divided. So, and she worked to really all over. So you can't really say, well, was she accommodationist? Was she agitating? She did everything, all right, as far as I'm concerned. So, um, again, help fund the NAACP, National Association of like colored women as well for like voting. Worked in the suffrage movement. Um, Always campaigned for women's right to vote like that. She's always for that. Um, Really met with Frederick Douglass while he was still alive to kind of like again kind of like talk from him about like things and what to do for the civil rights movement. So you had these three prominent people, and there's many more people, newspaper editors and things of that nature to keep in mind. Now the thing is, let's talk about the people. What is your definition of lynching? That's the thing is that people always get confused about. We need kind of a formal definition of lynching. All right. So, what do you immediately think of? You probably think of hanging because that's probably what you kind of prefer think of mob justice. And let's get this down. Lynching is killing someone. All right. Often by hanging for an alleged offense. It's killing someone often by hanging for alleged offense with or without legal trial. So you can have a trial, but the punishment is a lynching. You get it? What's that? You don't need a legal trial. Sometimes they would say these, in New Orleans, these Italian immigrants, they are guilty. And we've come here to the jail to get our justice. It's what really happened to Joseph Smith. He was lynched, as you know, in Illinois. So most victims are lynching are African Americans, but you could be other people too. Most of them are males, but there are women too, and there's some heinous lynching of African American women that I am not going to say here. It's like that. Look up to yourself, and it's just pretty graphic. Um, so, and again, Ida Wells is going to be exploring this and everything. She even wrote a book called Southern Horrors about this, about the lynchings here. But it's really mob justice. You're really getting like executed without any type of due process, and that's what's going to happen here. Now, I'm going to tell you, some of these people probably again did commit some heinous crimes, but usually by the Constitution you get like really due process. It's not just like against lynchings. But what Ida Wells explores, like, well, I want to see if these people are guilty. Maybe they assaulted a little girl. Well, again, what she found out after looking at the evidence is most of the time it's accusations, it's people accusing people. And again, what most people who are the targets, and this is the kind of the sad thing, but please look it up because I know people think that I'm making American history up. This didn't happen. They're mostly successful African Americans who are targeted, you know? So, because how do you like keep somebody down? It's like you get to the leaders, you get to the people who have economic success, and you kind of target them making some kind of accusation. And again, some of these things don't end in like some kind of murder. Sometimes it's getting people run out of town. Again, I don't want to think all people are victims. Immigrant groups, they had newspapers. African Americans formed organizations like the NAACP, who broadcast, who publicized about the lynchings that were occurring down south. Because if you think lynching is okay, what they would say, then you believe in white supremacy. Because usually the kind of people who was in this mob justice were mostly, white males carrying out this justice on people. And lynchings will be kind of like there's several thousand each year. I think around 1917, 1918, it was kind of like the height of lynching, about 2 or 3 thousand lynchings during that year. And it will go down in the 1920s, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why lynches kind of go down. And kind of ironically, as the Klan is increasing in power in the 1920s in here. All right. So you can, but it is really kind of the fear that like mob justice is going to take you away, do something to you and your community in here. So those three people, the lynchings that's going on, but the fight for justice, the organizations, the schooling, the education that these African American leaders are going to say is the way. W.B. Du Bois is saying the humanities. You get it? It can be just as good. Uh, Booker T. Washington saying, let's have more practical skills to be trained in. And they would be very professional. I told you, I'll say those three words again: dignity, discipline, independence. He always was trying to say, well, we need to have respect for ourselves before people, will respect us. But again, it's kind of crossing that line. That does that mean that you have to be discriminated against, or you can only go so far? And that was be the challenge between him and W. Du Bois and some of the others. And that's why Ada Wells was a little bit despondent with Booker T. Washington. She always liked Booker T. Washington, but she's more of an agitator. But then again, she's not an elitist like W.B. Du Bois, thinking that you have to be educated. She's like, well, you need to go out in the streets, you need to be active, you need to form things. She's there 1 year before she died, out in Chicago. She's going to a meeting about like they're talking about African American history, and and then a year later she dies, and a lot of times people like forgot about her, but a lot of historians really like said this is one of the most remarkable women of the 19th century, early 20th century, and she belongs up there with those two, or maybe even more. So there's actually I think they're building a statue of her, like I think in around here, some kind of commemoration for her, deservingly so, I have to say. So on that note, so expect 2 or 3 questions. Hopefully, I did not, I am not here, and then I'm going to shut off here. Please listen up, once again, and go back to these things here because there will be 2 or 3 questions on this a month besides winter race rides. Okay, cool. So.